Yale debate hall erupts in cruel laughter as Sarah Whitefeather drops her note cards. Second-hand blazer, wrinkled, hands trembling. 500 eyes pierce through her. Diversity hire, someone coughs. Judge Sterling glances at his gold watch. "Miss Whitefeather, from the Lakota Reservation Scholarship Program?" His voice drips condescension. Front row elites smirk. Cameras zoom in. The mic picks up her ragged breath. She's frozen, crumbling, exactly how they want her. But then, a breath, a lift of the chin. "Thank you for that introduction, Judge Sterling," she says. Her voice, steel. It perfectly illustrates my opening argument on institutional bias. Silence. Total. What happens next? You'll want to see it, because Sarah Whitefeather didn't travel 1,200 miles to be their victim. She came to burn their illusions to the ground. Have you ever been dismissed before you even opened your mouth? Where are you watching from? Because what happens next will remind you that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone underestimates. Drop a comment if you've ever proved the doubters wrong. Sarah Whitefeather grew up in a rusted trailer on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where running water was a luxury that disappeared for months at a time. Her mother, Grace, spent her days cleaning the floors and toilets at the local elementary school, coming home with cracked hands and a bent back. Her father, Thomas, had been a construction worker, until a beam fell wrong 2 years ago, crushing 3 vertebrae and ending his ability to provide for his family. Now he spent his days in a worn recliner, prescription painkillers barely dulling the constant agony, watching his daughter study by candlelight when the electricity got shut off again. But it was Sarah's grandmother, Mary Crowfeather, who shaped the girl's destiny. A former tribal council member with eyes like obsidian and a voice that could command attention in any room, Mary understood the power of words in ways that Yale professors would spend decades trying to learn. She taught Sarah the ancient art of storytelling, how to weave narratives that could make grown men weep or inspire warriors to battle. Every evening, while other children watched television, Sarah sat at her grandmother's feet, absorbing lessons about rhythm, cadence, and the precise moment to pause for maximum impact. Mary would say, "They may own the buildings, child, but you own your voice. Never let them take that from you." Sarah discovered her gift at 8 years old when she entered her first speech contest at the reservation school. Using her grandmother's techniques, she transformed a simple story about an eagle's flight into a meditation on freedom that left the judges speechless. By 14, she'd found her true calling in the dusty corner of the tribal library, hunched over an ancient computer that wheezed and groaned with every click. She'd stumbled upon Yale debate videos, and something in the rapid-fire exchange of ideas, the intellectual combat disguised as civilized discourse, ignited a hunger in her that nothing else could satisfy. With no money for proper textbooks, she taught herself debate theory using bootleg PDFs downloaded at the library and YouTube videos that buffered endlessly on the reservation's spotty internet. She created a mock debate club at her high school with just 3 members, including herself. They met in an abandoned classroom where the heating didn't work, their breath visible in the winter air as they argued about philosophy and constitutional law. During her 90-minute bus rides to school, bouncing over potholed roads, Sarah memorized entire sections of Kant and Rousseau, Supreme Court decisions, and economic theory. She graduated as valedictorian despite working 3 jobs, stocking shelves at the gas station, tutoring younger students, and helping her mother clean offices on weekends. Her acceptance to Yale came with a partial scholarship that covered 60% of tuition, a gesture that looked generous on paper but left a chasm of debt that seemed impossible to bridge. The recruiter who'd spotted her at the state speech competition had been filling a diversity quota, checking boxes on a form that demanded rural voices and underrepresented minorities. Sarah knew this. She'd seen the look in his eyes, the surprise when she delivered her argument about water rights with the precision of a seasoned attorney. The acceptance letter arrived 2 days after her grandmother died, the timing so cruel that Sarah had crumpled to the floor of the trailer, clutching the Yale letterhead, while her mother tried to plan a funeral with money they didn't have. Mary Crowfeather never got to see her granddaughter compete at Yale, but her words echoed in Sarah's mind as she packed her single suitcase for the journey east. Now, Sarah lives in the basement of Silliman College, in a room so small she can touch both walls by stretching out her arms. The administrative error that left her without a roommate was no error at all. She'd heard the housing coordinator's whispered conversation about not wanting to burden other students with her different lifestyle. Every morning at 3:30, her alarm drags her from exhausted sleep, and she trudges through empty campus paths to the dining hall, where she works the breakfast shift from 4 to 8. Her hands, once soft despite their poverty, are now marked with burns from industrial coffee machines and cuts from washing thousands of dishes. She attends classes with eyes burning from fatigue, taking notes while her stomach growls because she can't afford to eat the food she serves to her classmates. The study groups that form naturally after lectures somehow never have room for her. "Sorry, Sarah," they say with practiced smiles, "but your communication style just doesn't mesh with our dynamic." They mean her accent, the way certain words carry the rhythm of her grandmother's voice. They mean the way she doesn't laugh at their jokes about townies and service workers. They mean she doesn't belong. Her professors express constant surprise at her eloquence, their compliments poisoned with qualifiers. "You speak so well for someone from your background," or "It's amazing how you've overcome your circumstances to form such cogent arguments." Each word is a tiny cut, a reminder that her presence here is conditional, probationary, temporary. The debate team barely tolerates her existence. She's been relegated to alternate status, watching from the sidelines as lesser debaters take the podium. The coach, Professor Whitman, explained with false sympathy that she needs more time to develop the Yale style of argumentation. What he means is that she needs to strip away everything that makes her unique, to sand down her edges until she's indistinguishable from the prep school graduates who've been training for this since kindergarten. She's only standing at this podium in the national championship because Richard Chen, the golden boy of Yale debate, got caught buying a paper 48 hours ago. His suspension was quietly processed, the scandal suppressed, but Sarah stepped into his place like an understated understudy forced onto the stage. What would you do if the entire system was rigged against you? Drop your thoughts below. The sabotage started small, almost imperceptible. Marcus Wellington III, her assigned debate partner and heir to Wellington Holdings, began with scheduling conflicts. Mandatory practice sessions mysteriously appeared during her cafeteria shifts, and when she missed them to keep her job, Marcus reported her absences to Professor Whitman with theatrical concern. "I'm just worried about Sarah's commitment to the team," he'd say, his blue eyes wide with false sincerity. Behind closed doors, he was less subtle. "You're not Yale material," he'd hiss when they were alone. "You're a quota admission, a charity case. My father donated $5 million to this debate program. What has your family contributed besides a sob story?" The research packets for upcoming debates would arrive in her mailbox with crucial pages missing, or sometimes not at all. Marcus would claim technological difficulties, forwarding corrupted files minutes before competitions. Other debaters received comprehensive briefs on their opponents' tendencies and arguments. Sarah got blank pages and shrugged apologies. During practice rounds, he'd deliberately undermine her arguments, setting logical traps that made her positions untenable. The judges, many of whom attended Princeton or Harvard with Marcus's father, consistently scored her lower, with critiques so vague they were impossible to address: lacks polish, unconventional style, needs refinement. But Sarah had learned survival from her grandmother's stories of resistance. She began documenting everything in a coded journal, using a system inspired by the winter counts her ancestors kept to record history. Every slight, every sabotage, every biased scoring decision went into her careful records. Late nights in the law library, she studied the judges' past decisions, using algorithms she'd learned to identify patterns of bias. The data was damning. Competitors from similar backgrounds consistently scored 15 to 20% lower, regardless of performance quality. When Marcus made the mistake of bragging about his sabotage during what he thought was a friendly coffee meeting, Sarah's phone recorded every word from her pocket. Her most unexpected ally came in the form of Elijah Peterson, the night janitor who cleaned the debate hall. Sarah had noticed his careful attention during her practice sessions, the way he'd pause his mopping to listen to her arguments. One evening, as she practiced alone in the empty hall, he approached her with coffee and a revelation. "I was a civil rights lawyer once," he said quietly, "got disbarred in '95 for exposing how Yale was cooking admissions numbers. Your friend Marcus, his daddy bought that boy's spot, just like he's trying to buy this championship." Peterson had kept his networks, connections to journalists and activists who'd been waiting decades for another chance to expose the institution's corruption. The tournament progressed like a gauntlet designed to break her spirit. Round 1 assigned her the negative position on a wildly popular universal healthcare proposal, a position that went against everything her community desperately needed. But Sarah reframed the debate, using indigenous concepts of collective care and traditional medicine to argue for a more comprehensive approach than the simplistic proposal offered. The judges exchanged glances as she cited the Indian Health Service's failures, not as evidence against government health care, but as proof that one-size-fits-all solutions ignore community-specific needs. She won by the narrowest margin, one judge later admitting he'd never considered healthcare from a sovereignty perspective. Round 2 brought new obstacles when Marcus forgot to share the crucial evidence packet that contained their opponent's likely arguments. Sarah arrived at the podium with nothing but her wits and her grandmother's stories. As her opponent cited obscure economic studies, she responded with traditional Lakota concepts of wealth distribution, drawing parallels that made ancient wisdom suddenly relevant to modern policy. She wove her grandmother's story about the buffalo hunts into an argument about resource allocation that left the Harvard team scrambling to respond. The victory was narrow, purchased with quick thinking and the kind of deep knowledge that can't be found in any evidence packet. The technical malfunctions in round 3 were too precise to be accidental. Every time Sarah reached a crucial point in her argument, the microphone cut out with a piercing squeal. The technical team shrugged apologetically, claiming equipment failure, but she caught the smirk exchanged between the sound engineer and Marcus. Without missing a beat, Sarah stepped away from the podium and projected her voice using the traditional breath techniques her grandmother had taught her for calling across vast plains. Her voice filled the hall without amplification, carrying a power that made electronic enhancement seem weak by comparison. The judges leaned forward, captivated despite themselves by this display of pure human presence. Then came the semifinals and the twist that revealed the true depths of the system's cynicism. Sarah's opponent was Jalen Washington, a brilliant debater from inner-city Detroit who'd clawed his way to Yale through sheer determination. The only other scholarship student to make it this far, Jalen understood the game being played. The topic, affirmative action in higher education, was chosen specifically to pit them against each other, to force two beneficiaries of such programs to argue for or against their own presence at Yale. The administration wanted a gladiator match between their diversity admits, ensuring that one would eliminate the other while the privileged students advanced unopposed. They met at 2 a.m. in the basement of Sterling Library, surrounded by ancient books that had witnessed generations of similar struggles. Jalen's proposal was tempting in its righteousness. They both throw the match in protest, refuse to be pawns in Yale's diversity theater. They want us to dance for them, he said bitterly, to tear each other down while they take bets on which one of us breaks first. Sarah understood his anger. It burned in her too, a constant flame that threatened to consume everything she'd worked for. But she also heard her grandmother's voice, warning against letting the enemy define the terms of battle. That's what they want, Sarah replied, her voice steady with conviction. They want us to eliminate ourselves, to prove we don't belong here by refusing to compete. But what if we show them something they've never seen? What if we elevate each other instead? The debate that followed was unlike anything in Yale's storied history. Instead of attacking each other's positions, Sarah and Jalen built upon them, creating a dialogue about education, opportunity, and justice that transcended the artificial boundaries of competitive debate. They celebrated each other's insights, acknowledged the validity in opposing viewpoints, and demonstrated what intellectual discourse could be when stripped of ego and prejudice. Sarah won by a single point, but her first action was to share credit with Jalen, publicly declaring him her intellectual equal and promising to mentor him for future competitions. The audience, which had come expecting blood sport, witnessed something far more dangerous to the established order: solidarity. Jalen became her secret ally, feeding her information about Marcus's increasingly desperate plans to sabotage the finals. The friendship forged in that library basement would prove more valuable than any trophy. A reminder that the real victory lay not in defeating others like her, but in lifting them up. The environment at Yale began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Cafeteria workers who had served Sarah silently for months started attending her debates, bringing their friends and family. They stood in the back, still wearing their uniforms, their presence a quiet form of resistance that made the elite students uncomfortable. Progressive students began recording her speeches, creating an underground YouTube channel that quickly gained thousands of followers. The videos spread through networks of young people hungry for authentic voices, for someone who spoke truth without apologizing for her existence. An anonymous donor paid her remaining semester fees through the bursar's office, leaving only a note: for Mary Crowfeather's granddaughter. Sarah later learned it was Peterson's civil rights network, activists who'd been supporting students like her for decades without recognition or thanks. Rival teams started taking notes during her arguments, studying her unique synthesis of traditional knowledge and modern theory. A Harvard debater, the son of a senator, waited after a round to ask for her autograph, saying her argument about indigenous sovereignty had changed his entire worldview. Marcus watched his carefully constructed kingdom crumbling, his desperation growing as Sarah's influence expanded beyond anything he could control. Who's the underdog in your life that deserves recognition? Share their story in the comments. The national championship finals arrived with the kind of dramatic timing that would seem contrived in fiction, but was merely the universe's way of demanding justice. The topic, announced just hours before the debate, seemed personally crafted for this moment. Resolved. Meritocracy is a myth in American institutions. Sarah would argue the affirmative position that meritocracy was indeed a myth, while Marcus would defend the very system that had handed him everything while claiming he'd earned it. The irony was lost on no one, least of all Marcus, whose face had gone pale when the topic was announced. The judge panel read like a who's who of establishment power. Harrison Sterling III, now promoted to Supreme Court clerk. Margaret Ashford, CEO of a Fortune 500 company that had never promoted a woman of color above middle management. And Robert Hutchinson, dean of Yale Law School, whose admission policies were currently under federal investigation. The audience packed the hall beyond capacity, with media representatives tipped off by Jalen filling every available corner. Marcus's father, Charles Wellington, sat in the front row, surrounded by board trustees, his presence a reminder of the millions in donations that supposedly guaranteed his son's success. The dirty tricks intensified in the final hours before the debate. Sarah returned to her basement room after her final preparation session to find her door ajar, her research notes scattered across the floor like dead leaves. Every page of carefully compiled evidence, every statistic she'd painstakingly verified, had vanished. But Sarah had learned from her grandmother's stories about government agents destroying treaty documents. She'd kept copies hidden in 3 different locations, including one with Peterson and another uploaded to a secure cloud server Jalen had set up. The theft was inconvenient but not devastating, though the violation of her private space sent a clear message about how far they were willing to go. The morning of the finals, her cafeteria manager, pressured by someone up the administrative chain, threatened her job if she missed her shift. "Rules are rules," he said, though he couldn't meet her eyes. "You missed today, you don't come back." The breakfast shift would end just 30 minutes before the debate, leaving no time for preparation or even changing clothes. But Peterson appeared at 3:45 in the morning, wearing his old suit from his lawyer days. "I'll cover your shift," he said simply. "Some fights are worth losing a job over." As Sarah tried to thank him, he waved her away. "Just remember us when you're running this place someday." 5 minutes before the debate, as Sarah stood in the wings reviewing her opening, Marcus appeared beside her like a bad penny. His cologne was expensive enough to fund a semester at community college, and his smile held all the warmth of a January morning in South Dakota. He held up his phone, showing photos he'd somehow obtained of her family's trailer. Her father in his wheelchair, her mother's worn hands. "Just wanted to remind you where you belong," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "These people are never going to accept you. Why don't you save yourself the humiliation?" Her phone buzzed with an anonymous text. "Drop out now, or your scholarship disappears tomorrow." As Sarah walked to the podium, the technical team began testing the sound system, sending ear-piercing feedback through the speakers. The audience winced and covered their ears, but Sarah stood calmly, waiting. She'd anticipated this, had practiced projecting over construction noise at home. When the squealing finally stopped and the room settled into uncomfortable silence, she looked directly at Marcus, then at his father, then at the judges. Her opening words cut through the room like a blade through silk. "I stand here not despite my background, but because of it. Every obstacle placed in my path has only sharpened my argument. Shall we begin?" She opened with a move that turned their weapons against them. "Distinguished judges, esteemed audience, my worthy opponent, I'd like to thank you all for the perfect demonstration of my thesis. In the past 72 hours alone, you've provided me with enough evidence to write a dissertation on institutional bias." She detailed each act of sabotage with clinical precision, transforming their dirty tricks into data points. The stolen notes became evidence of academic gatekeeping. The scheduling conflicts illustrated systemic barriers to economic mobility. The technical difficulties demonstrated how institutions weaponize infrastructure against outsiders. Marcus shifted uncomfortably as Sarah revealed she'd anticipated every move. My opponent comes from a family whose fortune, she paused, letting the word hang in the air, was built on predatory loans to Native American communities in the 1980s. Public records show Wellington Holdings foreclosed on over 300 homes on reservations across the Midwest, profiting from legislation designed to help indigenous families achieve homeownership. The color drained from Charles Wellington's face as reporters began furiously typing on their phones. Sarah had done what Marcus never thought possible. She'd researched his family's history with the same thoroughness he'd applied to hers. Her argument wove together personal narrative and political theory with the skill of a master craftsman. She incorporated the Lakota concept of 7 generations into economic theory, arguing that true meritocracy would consider the impact of decisions on descendants 7 generations in the future. My grandmother taught me that every decision must be weighed against its effect on children not yet born. Yet here at Yale, decisions are made based on donations from fortunes built on exploitation. Where is the merit in that? Each interruption from the technical booth became further evidence, which she acknowledged with devastating courtesy. Thank you for proving my point about institutional interference. Please, continue. The revelation moment came when Sarah produced her phone and played the recording of Marcus admitting to sabotage. His voice filled the hall, bragging about giving her wrong research topics, scheduling conflicts, and putting that reservation girl in her place. But Sarah didn't stop there. She revealed Judge Sterling's son had failed the very ethics course Sterling taught, only to have his grade mysteriously changed after a significant family donation. She presented documented evidence showing 89% of scholarship students had been forced out within 2 years, using identical tactics to what she'd experienced. She named 47 students by name, their dreams crushed by systematic exclusion masquerading as academic standards. This debate isn't about the topic, Sarah declared, her voice rising with controlled passion. This debate is the topic. Every moment of these championships has been a live demonstration of how meritocracy is a myth used to justify inherited privilege. My opponent stands here not because of his superior argumentation skills, which we'll examine momentarily, but because his father purchased this podium with donations extracted from communities like mine. And I stand here not because Yale wanted me, but because they needed me, a props in their diversity theater meant to fail gracefully and validate their narrative that we simply can't compete. Marcus attempted his rebuttal with the desperation of a drowning man grasping at straws. His usual polished demeanor cracked as he stumbled over prepared attacks that no longer applied. My opponent is playing the victim card, he sputtered, falling back on tired rhetoric. This is reverse discrimination at its finest. She wants to tear down successful institutions simply because... But Sarah interrupted with surgical precision. I'm not a victim, she said, her voice carrying the strength of generations. I'm evidence. And you're about to be a footnote in the history of how these institutions finally changed. She systematically deconstructed his arguments using his own social media posts, which Jalen had helped her archive. Screenshots appeared on the projection screen showing Marcus bragging about never reading assigned texts because daddy's lawyers write better arguments anyway. Another post joked about hiring students from the scholarship program to write his papers, putting their education to good use. When Marcus claimed he'd earned his position through hard work, Sarah presented his high school transcripts, obtained through the same channels he'd used to photograph her family, showing a miraculous rate improvement coinciding exactly with his father's first major donation to the school. The death blow came when Sarah forced Marcus to admit, through careful questioning, that he couldn't identify the primary sources he was citing. He'd memorized talking points without understanding the underlying philosophy, parroting arguments crafted by hired consultants. When Sarah asked him to explain the difference between Rawls' veil of ignorance and Mill's racial contract theory, concepts central to his argument, he froze like a deer in headlights. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the audience realized the Yale Golden Boy had never actually engaged with the material he claimed to champion. Sarah filled the silence with grace. This is meritocracy's greatest myth, that privilege can purchase understanding. Sarah's final round became a masterclass in argumentation that professors would study for years to come. She structured her closing in 3 parts, each building upon the last with devastating logic. First, she presented historical evidence of institutional gatekeeping, tracing Yale's admission policies from explicit racial exclusion to the current system of legacy preferences and donor influence. She showed how the language had evolved while the outcomes remained identical, exclusion dressed in prettier words. The data was irrefutable, drawn from Yale's own archives and presented with a lawyer's precision. Second, she reframed personal testimony as empirical data, arguing that lived experience constituted a form of knowledge that academic institutions systematically devalued. My grandmother's stories about surviving boarding schools contain more wisdom about education than any pedagogy textbook, she declared. My mother's insights from cleaning these hallways for 20 years reveal more about how this institution functions than any organizational chart. Yet their knowledge is dismissed as anecdotal, while my opponent's purchased opinions are treated as gospel. This isn't meritocracy, it's intellectual colonialism. The third part of her argument presented a solution framework based on indigenous justice models, proposing a complete reimagining of competitive debate. Instead of adversarial combat designed to crush opponents, she envisioned collaborative discourse aimed at collective truth-seeking. She cited the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's consensus-building practices, demonstrating how complex decisions could be reached without declaring winners and losers. The audience began to see debate not as a zero-sum game, but as a method for elevating community wisdom. By the time she concluded, half the audience was on their feet, and the standing ovation was led by the cafeteria workers in the back row. The judges huddled for an unprecedented 20 minutes, their whispered arguments audible in the hushed hall. Sterling gestured angrily at the rulebook, while Ashford kept glancing at the media section, calculating the optics of various outcomes. Hutchinson sat silent, perhaps remembering his own climb from working-class roots before he'd learned to pull the ladder up behind him. They couldn't deny the obvious winner without committing career suicide in front of rolling cameras and live streams reaching 500,000 viewers. When they finally announced the unanimous decision in Sarah's favor, Sterling's voice sounded like he was chewing glass. Marcus stormed out before the results were fully announced, his father close behind, both fleeing the scene of their public humiliation, but Sarah barely noticed their departure. She was surrounded by a sea of faces. Peterson weeping openly, Jalen pumping his fist in the air, cafeteria workers she'd served beside that very morning embracing her like family. Someone thrust the championship trophy into her hands, but it felt lighter than the weight that had lifted from her shoulder. She'd done more than win a debate. She'd exposed a system and lived to tell about it. Within 24 hours, Sarah's phone became unusable from the flood of calls and messages. Harvard Law offered a full scholarship with a personal note from the dean praising her transformative approach to legal argumentation. Stanford followed suit, as did Columbia and Chicago. Yale, desperate to avoid the public relations disaster of losing her to a rival, suddenly discovered they could match any offer and throw in a research position besides. Speaking requests poured in from universities across the country, all wanting to hear from the woman who'd turned their comfortable assumptions inside out. A major publisher offered a six-figure advance for her memoir, suggesting the title, From Pine Ridge to the Podium, An American Story. The consequences for those who'd tried to destroy her came swiftly. Charles Wellington found himself under federal investigation for tax schemes related to his charitable donations. The connections between his contributions and his son's academic advancement created a paper trail that forensic accountants followed with glee. Marcus quietly withdrew from Yale, his social media presence vanishing overnight as lawyers advised him to maintain a low profile. Judge Sterling resigned from his Supreme Court clerkship when reporters began investigating patterns in his scoring history. The debate team's entire coaching staff was replaced, and a new blind judging system was implemented nationally to prevent bias based on competitors' backgrounds. But Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from the changes that rippled outward from her victory. She chose to remain at Yale, explaining to those who wondered why she'd stay at an institution that had tried to break her. "I stay where the work needs doing. They need me here more than Harvard does." With her prize money and additional donations that poured in from Peterson's network and beyond, she established the Pine Ridge Debate Academy, bringing the tools of intellectual combat to reservation students who'd been told their voices didn't matter. The Academy's first class of 12 students included her younger cousin, who'd watched Sarah's victory on a borrowed phone and decided she too had something to say. Peterson's story became its own sensation when journalists investigated the civil rights lawyer who'd spent 25 years cleaning the floors of the institution that had destroyed his career. His disbarment was overturned in a unanimous decision, the judge noting that his only crime had been telling the truth 2 decades too early. Yale offered him a position teaching ethics in the law school, which he accepted with the condition that Sarah serve as his teaching assistant. Together, they developed a curriculum that centered marginalized voices and challenged students to examine their own privilege. Their class had a waiting list every semester. Jalen became Sarah's debate partner for international competitions, and together they revolutionized the format. They refused to engage in traditional adversarial debates, instead demonstrating collaborative argumentation that sought truth rather than victory. At the World University's debating championship, they caused a sensation by sharing their time equally, building on each other's arguments and acknowledging when their opponents made valid points. They didn't win by the traditional scoring metrics, but the standing ovation they received lasted 10 minutes, and the international debate community began discussing rule changes inspired by their approach. The media coverage of Sarah's victory sparked a national conversation about meritocracy and access in higher education. The recording of Marcus's sabotage attempts went viral, becoming a symbol of how privilege protects itself through systematic exclusion. Parents who'd never questioned legacy admissions began asking uncomfortable questions at alumni gatherings. Students at elite institutions across the country started documenting their own experiences with bias and gatekeeping. The hashtag Sarah was right trended for weeks as people shared stories of dreams deferred by systems designed to exclude them. 6 months after her victory, Sarah received an invitation, printed on cardstock so expensive it could have fed a family for a week. The White House requested her presence at a summit on educational equity. She arrived in the same secondhand blazer she'd worn to the championship, now a symbol rather than a source of shame. As she stood in the Roosevelt Room, surrounded by politicians and policymakers who suddenly wanted to hear her ideas, she thought of her grandmother's words about owning her voice. She spoke for 45 minutes without notes, weaving together personal narrative and policy proposals with the skill that had made her a champion. But the moment that mattered most came later, away from cameras and microphones. Sarah stood at her grandmother's grave on a windswept hill overlooking the Badlands. The championship trophy sat beside the simple headstone, its gold surface reflecting the endless sky. "You were right, Grandma," she whispered to the wind. "I owned my voice, but more than that, I helped others find theirs too." Her phone buzzed with another interview request, another opportunity to speak truth to power. She silenced it and sat in the grass beside the grave, listening to the wind carry stories across the plains. A year later, Native American participation in national debate had increased by 400%. Reservation schools that had never had debate programs suddenly found funding and volunteer coaches. Sarah's victory had shown young Indigenous students that their perspectives weren't just valid but essential. They brought traditional knowledge to arguments about environmental policy, consensus building to discussions of governance, and lived experience to debates about poverty and education. The face of American academic debate was changing, one voice at a time. Sarah graduated summa cum laude from Yale, delivering a commencement address that made national news. She spoke of bridges not burning them, but building them, creating pathways for others to cross the chasms that privilege creates. She thanked Marcus Wellington by name, saying his opposition had taught her more about institutional power than any textbook could. She thanked the judges who'd scored her low, the students who'd laughed at her accent, the professors who'd doubted her intellect. "You showed me exactly what needed to change," she said, "and you gave me the motivation to change it." The week before starting at Yale Law, she'd chosen to stay, to continue the work where it was needed most. Sarah returned to Pine Ridge. The Debate Academy was hosting its first tournament, and she served as head judge. Watching 12-year-olds argue passionately about water rights and educational funding, she saw herself in their fierce determination. One girl, nervous and shaking just as Sarah had been, took the podium. But when she spoke, her voice carried the strength of her ancestors, the wisdom of her community, the power of her own brilliant mind. Sarah smiled, remembering another girl who'd once stood trembling before hostile judges. The documentary ends with a simple statistic. Since Sarah Whitefeather's victory, over 3,000 students from marginalized communities have entered competitive debate. They win 67% of their rounds. The institutions are finally learning to listen. But Sarah knows the real victory isn't in trophies or statistics. It's in the voices that now fill halls once dominated by privilege, in the stories being told by those who were taught to be silent, in the system slowly, painfully transforming because someone refused to accept that birth determines worth. Somewhere in South Dakota, a grandmother's spirit smiles, knowing her granddaughter didn't just own her voice, she helped a generation find theirs.